Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience. Coming at you on a Friday, trying to do something that's going to live for a little while so you can go back and watch it. Not necessarily going to break down any more NFL games. We've done that throughout the course of the week, and we're back for Super Bowl and all that fun stuff. But I had a big guest, a future member of the Fantasy Sports Writers Association Hall of Fame. He's going in this year. It's Brad Evans. What's going on, dude?
Hola, amigo. I am spectacular, my friend. I would say that some of my ventures away from fantasy not doing so hot right now, but at least I have DFS to lean on.
Oh, you're shaking your fist at Litecoin these days?
Yes, correct.
See, at least you're one of the few people that are on Twitter that aren't just constantly going on about their crypto ventures. Like, yeah, I appreciate that you're not getting into that.
No, I quite honestly, I don't understand it. Because
does anyone?
It's a speculative currency backed by nothing but speculation. So for those people that are going to continue to ride this and believe it's going to be a gravy train, it's going to take you to, $20,000 per coin riches, after this massive crash, good luck to you. Why don't you invest in gold instead? That's a commodity that continues to hold value for centuries.
No. I heard that gold is going extinct because the cryptocurrency is just replacing. That's all I've heard.
Oh my God. Cryptocurrencies, man. If somebody wants to, try to put it in layman's terms for me, please follow me on Twitter at Yahoo Noise and explain it to me because I'm too much of an idiot to figure it out.
I see. I think enough people follow you already. You got to bleed some of those followers over to me. I could use them. I'm not going to lie to you. But you are going into the Hall of Fame for the Fantasy Sports Writers Association. Like I said, congratulations. How long have you been doing this now? Because I think it's the wait time's you have to be at least 10 years in, and you don't look like an old man. How is it? You didn't do this when you were 18. What's going on here?
Well, I'm on the brink of 40, so I don't know if I'm going to survive the party that's going to happen potentially in Las Vegas for my 40th birthday. But no, I've been in this business for, full time now, almost 12 years, all at Yahoo. Although, I started with TalentedMrRoto.com back in 2004. So I've been in the business 13 years. And, that was the site, of course, that the esteemed Matthew Berry, now of ESPN fame, had created. And a lot of great writers came from that site, were birthed from it. My colleague Andy Behrens at Yahoo Sports being one of them, Christopher Harris, who's got an outstanding podcast that's up for a Fantasy Sports Writers Association award called the Harris Podcast. Of course, he was at ESPN. Pierre Beckway, who's one of the deputy editors right now at ESPN. I mean, the list goes on and on. The number of people that came out of that community and really made a name for themselves in the fantasy industry. So I was there for about 2 years and then went to Yahoo full-time in 2006. And I've been there ever since. And it seemed to can't get rid of me for whatever reason.
Yeah, well, this was something you actually had brought up the other day that I really wanted to talk to you about specifically because I came in a little bit later on. I started in around 2009 getting into the business. And obviously it probably changed a lot in those 5 years. I just look at it now. Over the past, it's bordering on a decade now. So over the last 9 years, breaking into the industry is completely different. So I did want to talk to you a little bit about how, not necessarily how to get a full-time job doing this, but what are some ways that you can get yourself noticed? Because even when I started a blog that no one really read. But I basically spammed Facebook was just starting to get big at the time. So I went on every potential Facebook page there wasn't to spam my articles. Eventually someone noticed, and I worked my way up from there. But I didn't get a full-time gig in fantasy, until basically I started doing video. And at the time, that was a hot commodity as it came along because no one else could do it. Now, everyone can basically do video. So if I was trying to break in today, I don't know how successful I would have been. So what do you do if you're... Hell, you can be a 22-year-old just getting out of college. You can be a 45-year-old dude or lady trying to break into the industry right now that, it's just something that they want to do. Where do you start?
Well, I still think you got to cut your teeth writing. I think the blogosphere isn't completely dead. You could build a lot of great content from that kind of environment. You look at a site like RotoGrinders, which has been around for a while now, but there are a lot of other smaller mom and pop shop sites that are starting to creep up in the industry that are doing it right. And they're starting with writing. So first and foremost, figuring out your unique voice in that kind of atmosphere, I think is an appropriate way. And, similar to what you have done and what I've done in the past, you got to hustle, right? So you got to try to network, attending the Fantasy Sports Trade Association conference, which is, interestingly, coincidentally, occurring next week in Los Angeles, is a great way to press the flesh and shake hands. A lot of big wigs in the industry to get your name out there. try to get some notoriety, try to build up a brand. But you also got to be vertical, or versatile, excuse me. In other words, not only just writing, but like in video, also with audio, with podcasting, which is a big deal. I know the market is saturated, but still there's room there if you, again, have that unique voice. And with social media, with the advent of Facebook Live, that's a medium right now that people are still trying to figure out. How can it be monetized? How can you grow it? But it doesn't take much. I mean, you can record everything on your, mobile device anymore with the, high-res cameras that they have and put it out there on the web. As long as it's quality content, you got a great voice that goes along with it, you check all the boxes in those areas of versatility and be that Swiss Army knife, you could definitely make inroads in this business. But it is difficult because the industry is still young, and a lot of those full-time jobs that exist, they're filled, and they're filled by people still in their 40s. I mean, look at the old hat like Matthew Berry and Brandon Funston and Andy Behrens. They're 6 years older than me. They're still in their mid-40s. So they're still very young men, and it's difficult to penetrate the industry as a result. So, that's why a lot of people are, kind of scratching, clawing, and working full-time jobs elsewhere to get by on ends meet.
Yeah, I mean, when I was trying to go in, and this speaks to a lot of it too, that it's a fun job. And I think that everyone who works in this industry will tell you exactly the same thing, that the reason that they get into it, they're either sports fans, they enjoy writing, they enjoy broadcasting, whatever it is, but they like playing fantasy sports, and it's fun to show up every single day, and this is what you talk about. Even though I try to branch out from here and there and do Fantasy Bachelor, and try to tie in the fantasy to my brand, whatever, but I think that's actually done well for me to branch out in those different ways, just to hit a different part of the audience. Like, just... It's so hard being a fantasy writer in the fantasy industry in general. I assume you guys see this at Yahoo in terms of when you look at the demographic breakdowns of who's actually playing these games. Like, what's the female percentage actually playing in fantasy sports? Maybe 10%?
No, it's more than that, actually.
Is it?
So, the Ipsos research that the Fantasy Sports Trade Association culls together every single year, it's about a third of the fantasy playing audience.
I am dubious of the FSTA research numbers. I really am.
I understand. I get it. But, just kind of looking at a slice of some of the demographics, through the advanced analytics that Twitter tracks, I would go out and say that with confidence, about 20% of my audience are female. So, it's still predominantly male. It's still predominantly young males in that, 18 to 35 demo. But still, the female audience is growing. And, we've got some great industry voices like my esteemed colleague, Liz Loza, who has, been a bullhorn for women in the industry, along with Brandon Marion Lee, who, of course, is with Fantasy Alarm. So, I think there are more women that are attracted to fantasy. There are a lot of women that, are starting to dabble into DFS as well. But, still football is king. You don't see a lot of women transitioning necessarily into fantasy baseball, fantasy basketball, some of the other fringy fantasy sports that are out there. But definitely, I would say, is it growing at an exponential rate? No, but we are seeing some marginal growth with the female demo in the fantasy space, and that's very encouraging for the health of the industry long term.
So if I'm Pat Mayo today trying to get into the business, and all I do is I start my blog and I'm writing about football, is there a path for me to really break in? Like, it would have to be the greatest blog of all time, which I can assure you it would not be. It wasn't back then. It's not going to be right now. But, like, how do you advance out of that? Like, you do college basketball, I do golf, I cover MMA, I cover Bachelor, TV, stuff like that. You have the other interests you do, like we both gave up baseball at one point because it was just too much to get into. And the shelf life for this content wasn't huge. One of the main reasons I ended up getting into golf, because it's a lot like football. It happens once a week. You can gear your content for one day of it happening, and it can last for 3-4 days. If you do baseball, you record something at 7 a.m., the lineup changes at 1 p.m. when the first set of games come out, you're screwed. Like, there was no point of listening to it to begin with. It's so difficult to gear stuff. Even basketball, if a guy gets hurt or a guy gets pronounced inactive at 6:54 p.m., what do you do? Something up in 6 minutes? You almost have to be live to do that stuff. It's very difficult to conform content, or your entire article, your entire video is like, well, if this guy doesn't play, then here's what you do. Or if this guy doesn't play, or these two guys don't play, now you have to readjust everything. It just becomes difficult to consume. And I've always thought that communication was the hardest skill of all of this. And this kind of got into another Twitter conversation that I saw is, do fantasy analysts need to be really good at fantasy? And I mean, I don't think that they do. I think it helps, obviously, and if you're
Yeah, it certainly helps.
If you're selling picks, then I think you really do need to be good. But for free content that people are consuming, I think you need to be well researched. Your information has to be good, but it's about being able to communicate all that information. Like, there are a ton of great analytics guys, whether it be in any sport, but they have a very difficult time actually translating that to the people because it's just so difficult to understand.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the perception of fantasy in general. This is why you're not seeing a lot of, well, it's rare. It's non-existent. You don't see fantasy analysts sitting at the desk on an NFL pregame show, right? It's like if there is a separate show, it's just all fantasy people, and they're not integrating those people with the Howie Longs of the world and the Fox pregame setup. So, I think that's going to change eventually. But, if you want to break in this industry, the great thing that we have at our disposal in this day and age is instantaneous consumption through social media. So, like you said, you could have a piece of content that you taped earlier today, and all of a sudden, well, it's already outdated 2 hours later. But you could address any kind of late scratch, whether it be an NBA lineup or a baseball lineup or whatever it may be, maybe an NFL event that comes down the pipe, and you can just record it on your phone and throw it up on Twitter. It's snack size content, and that's going to be really the next big thing, I think, in the fantasy sports industry, and utilizing the tools of social media, particularly Twitter, and maybe to a certain extent Instagram. Some people still dabble in Snapchat, though that's a much younger audience. But it is quick, it's actionable information with hard-hitting opinion. It could be a 20-second, a 30-second take. You tape on your phone, and you just throw it up on the web, and it's, all right, hey, Brandon Cooks is out. You need to go out and get Malcolm Mitchell today and plug him into your lineup because this is exploit this Cleveland Browns secondary, whatever it may be. I think that is the direction the industry is heading, because that's what the marketplace is demanding. That's how people are consuming information, is through quick, instantaneous, lightning speed takes, and playing to that social media audience and that vibe in general. So again, if you want to break in the industry, versatility is key. Pat is a prime example of that. You want to be not only versatile in terms of your presentation, but also versatile in terms of the sports that you're covering. But right now, it's kind of a less is more approach, a lot of content, but in smaller doses to the consumer.
Yeah, if you can constantly be hitting the market with something new, it constantly makes it look like you're doing stuff, which you are, but you can kind of piece it up in different ways to make it seem like you're constantly active. And even just learning the social media game of even such stuff like scheduling tweets. It sounds stupid, but it always makes you look like you're around, and people will engage with you, and people will see that. It generates likes that show up on other people's timelines, and boom, it's just more clicks and more eyeballs on what you're trying to do. But I disagree with you on that. I don't think that you're going to see fantasy analysts ever integrated into like an NFL pregame show, because I think that the audience for these things, almost like TV in general, is just getting cut down and cut down and cut down. That if my dad, who doesn't give a shit about fantasy whatsoever, he likes that I do it, he's happy with that, but he doesn't play it, he doesn't care, but he will tune in to watch the Fox pregame show or the CBS pregame show because he wants to hear from those guys. He doesn't want to hear from a guy like me on that show. And conversely, if you're someone who does care about fantasy, you don't want to see one fantasy guy sitting up with a bunch of ex-football players who just have no insight to what you're actually talking about. They'd rather see 4 fantasy people argue about, hey, here's the leverage play that you need, here's the sleeper that you need to be looking for. I just think it depends on what your interest is, that you'll just gravitate to one specific niche show or just the overall broad one if you're just sort of a casual fan.
Well, I think the transition point will occur is when there's a fantasy analyst that maybe tapes a 1-minute segment of like the top 3 sleepers of the day, and then that is integrated into that traditional format. And I think that's coming, and I think it's coming soon.
Is it you? Are you doing it?
I mean, I think it will. I don't know. No, it's not going to be me. I can tell you that. I've had conversations with some major media companies about this idea, and it's been stalled at the very high levels. I understand your father's perspective. And how old is your dad, just out of curiosity?
Surprisingly, my dad is a relatively young 51.
Okay, so he's in his 50s. Yeah, he's very young. So he's probably right there on the cusp of when fantasy exploded and really started to take off, in, say, the late 90s. So he just missed that boat. So he's still kind of thinking in archaic terms. Not to say your dad's antiquated by any stretch of the imagination.
He is. He definitely is.
So he's an old school thinker, and that's totally fine. And there's, it's consumers for everything. But I think as, my generation, your generation, the generation before us of fantasy players, they get a little bit older, they're going to demand smarter content, on those pregame platforms. And you may see more than one fantasy analyst alongside a Nate Burleson or a Howie Long or a Terry Bradshaw, whoever it may be, whether it's on CBS or Fox or wherever it is, or ESPN and their pregame show. But, fans are smarter nowadays because of fantasy. They want advanced numbers. And if, let's talk about the elephant in the room with sports gambling. If PASPA is struck down, right, then you're going to have this gambling audience that's going to want information so they can place a wager down to try to get the information that they feel are making a confident decision. And that plays into the fantasy audience as well. So it's all about analytics. It's all about integration. It's all about balance and perspective. And I think you're going to see some of these old hat producers at these high major media companies starting to come around the notion that, look, fantasy is not so niche. This is mainstream. We need to appeal to that audience instead of having Rob Riggle cut a 2-minute boring, not funny segment on Fox.
Shots fired at Rob Riggle, by the way. I like Rob Riggle. I find him funny.
I
find him funny.
But I don't think his segments are all that humorous.
Fair enough, but that's the platform, especially on Fox, it's worked in the past. You put the comedian in that role. I mean, I remember 20 years ago probably, or 15 years ago. It was Jimmy Kimmel. Before he had his show, he was the one on there doing the same thing, and people recognize those faces. Even if you put Matthew Berry into that spot, and if it was on ESPN, that would be one thing, but if you threw him into CBS or Fox or one of these older audiences that don't consume fantasy full-time, they're just going to be like, who the hell is this guy? At least with the celebrities, they do know who they are, and I think that does go a long way.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And, that's that star power that a lot of the, multimedia, companies are trying to bring in even into the digital, content side of things. It's not just in terms of terrestrial television consumption. So I just think that the mentality will change because consumers will demand it. We're already starting to see, just look at the broadcast booth. I take Chris Collinsworth, for example, and Al Michaels. Remember, they would just, be tongue-in-cheek with the fantasy jokes here and there, be like, oh, fantasy owners must be happy with that. But now you got Collinsworth, who is really integrated into the fantasy community because he owns Pro Football Focus. And he uses a lot of that data in the broadcast, which is playing to who? It's playing to the fantasy audience, clearly. Because your typical consumer of NFL programming, they don't care about the stats. They just care about the violent hits. They care about, wins and losses. But, talking about elusive rating, talking about yards after contact per attempt, talking about adjusted completion percentage, all these unique stats that Pro Football Focus tracks, and then they present it in this graphical presentation on air. Again, that is catering specifically to the fantasy fan. So that is a stepping stone to more commentary in the space, and you're going to see that spill over then into other programs.
I think it does work in merging the two, because once people start understanding what some of these advanced analytics are, or at least why that people do look at them and what they're for in terms of prognostication, and making that more mainstream, I think that really helps. But I think one of the main reasons that Collinsworth ended up integrating the PFF numbers into the broadcast, because it just gives him something different to talk about as opposed to the rest of the broadcasters, and it makes that broadcast actually unique. And you talk about the graphical inclusions. I mean, it's tough for me without any rights to NFL or any sport whatsoever that I can't just put, hey, I'm going to talk about Tiger Woods this week. Here's 5 shots from Tiger Woods. I don't have the ability to do that, so I've tried to work in a lot of graphical work just to break the show up, to make it more entertaining and more visually appealing to the viewer. I think that's one of the parts why Collinsworth, I think it's a great tool in terms of research, don't get me wrong, but I think it does go hand in hand with the broadcast and jazzing it up a bit to make it look unique, different, and informative at the same time.
Yeah, it was going to be interesting to see what the path is here, because I think you're going to see, maybe not a tide shift, but you're going to see at least some more subtle changes that occur in broadcast television and how it appeals to the fantasy audience in the upcoming 2018 season. It's going to happen. I think the NBA is doing a fantastic job of kind of spearheading this movement. The NBA has always embraced fantasy. They have some great tools that are available on NBA.com. They just signed a huge deal with Yahoo Sports for, game broadcast within the Yahoo Sports app. And fantasy is a big part of that because people want to watch their players perform in real time, whether they're at home in front of their television or, at a kid's birthday party. And, the only device that they have to, view the information is in their hands. So you're seeing transitions right now. The major shift is probably a couple of years away. But I can tell you right now, behind the scenes, there are ongoing conversations with some of these television executives of how to include fantasy more. But until we see that analyst at the desk on a Sunday morning, it's going to be more or less a digital play. And quite honestly, that's where everything's heading anyway.
Yeah, I think this will always end up being a digital move. But even in the broadcast booth, when you have like Al Michaels and Chris Collinsworth, there's a lack of full-time jobs in terms of the fantasy writing community. Broadcasting some of these games is an even smaller community. Like when I went to broadcasting school, that's really what I wanted to do. And after about 7 days, I was like, well, this isn't going to happen for me. Everyone has told me that this just is not a play that I really want to do. Get into something else. Work on your content. Try to create some video. You can talk for hours. Just go nuts with that format instead. But I think digital, at least, and I'm surprised that some of the companies haven't really tried to integrate this at all, is, you have it's almost like in wrestling. You know how there's like JR and the King, they're doing one. Obviously, they're not doing it anymore, but then you have the Spanish announce team. Why isn't there another feed that I can click on? Let's say I don't like Troy Aikman and Joe Buck. Why doesn't Fox present a fantasy-friendly feed? Why doesn't it have two guys who are stoned on a couch making jokes the entire time? If that's the vibe I want to listen to, why isn't that available? Because that doesn't seem like it would be super expensive to do.
No, it's not. In this day and age, I mean, it's just a single shot. You just need some decent lighting, and you're going to go. I mean, there's nothing to it. I mean, my setup would be perfect for that. You're going to see that, I think, trend in that direction. These alternative broadcasts are going to be available. I think, ESPN has experimented with that. We saw it with a college football championship game where they had 5 or 6 different broadcasts. One was a coach's room. One where it was a bunch of ESPN personalities hanging out on a couch, eating Cheetos and drinking Sprite, just commenting on the game. I think that variance, getting away from the classic 2-man or 3-man booth where there has been zero evolution in presentation. I think you're going to see some of these alternative offerings for tentpole events, like a Super Bowl, for example. You see it with the NCAA tournament. In the championship game, you'll have the hometown broadcasts, right, that are on a different channel for that particular team, whoever it is, if you don't want to listen to the fair and balanced approach on the main broadcast. So I agree that there should be some sort of fantasy, alternative broadcast. I came up with an idea this year to do a different fantasy pregame show to Thursday Night Football because I was just so frustrated watching a bunch of ex-jocks talking cliches about the Thursday night game. I'm like, this is serving nobody. This is serving nobody except for the people like your dad who want to sit there and go Goo and Gaga over Tony Gonzalez or whoever it may be, in the studio. There's an audience there that demands more, and that's why we created the Fantasy Football Happy Hour on Yahoo Sports, and we streamed it on Facebook Live. And Andy Behrens, Liz Lowe's, and I were sitting there with beverages in hand, breaking down not only the Thursday night game but all the latest news and notes to get people prepared to make smart lineup decisions leading up to kickoff on Thursday Night Football. So, broadcasts like that pregame are coming, are already there. So check them out if you haven't already. And in terms of alternative broadcasts in-game, I think you're going to see more of that, similar to what DirecTV does on Sundays with their NFL fantasy channel.
Well, let's talk about Red Zone for a second, because I think that was, people like that you could just, hey, here are all the scores, here's who's in contention, but it's really for fantasy owners. Let's be real here.
Yeah, totally.
That's who really likes the Red Zone channel. But does it get more micro from the Red Zone channel? I've always had an idea for years. The worst broadcasted sport on the planet is golf. And I just know this because I try to watch a lot of golf, and it's impossible to watch a lot of golf just because they won't put it on. But weirdly enough, you're sad, and especially in terms of DraftKings kind of blew this out of the water because DraftKings golf became so popular, people started getting into golf. Hey, I got nothing to do I'm at work on a Thursday morning. I'll turn on my PGA Tour Live app, and you can watch 3 golfers. That's it. And you watch them walk around the course. There is no sport, because all people ever claim is that golf is boring. And if you watch Jordan Spieth walk around the course and you only watch his shots or the shots of 3 people, it's going to be incredibly boring. Yeah. The worst time to ever watch a golf tournament, unless there's complete drama at the end, is the last 3 holes with 2 guys left on the course. Match play is horrible to watch once it gets down to the end. But on Thursday, you got 156 guys on the field. You could be showing lightning shots. Here's a shot. Here's a shot. Let's go here. Let's go here. I just don't understand why the Red Zone mentality being as popular as it is, maybe people just think it's going to be a pure football thing. But like, why doesn't the NFL sell me an app that I can have for like my iPad while I'm watching the games? Here are the 8 guys I'm focused on in fantasy, and I can just have little screens of each of those 8 guys so I can always see what they're up to.
Well, we've seen some of that come into play. I know there's been individual highlights that have been cut before in previous deals. I'm trying to remember who had that specific offering, but it was like instantaneous highlights. So if your guy scored a touchdown, you can go to your fantasy roster, your clubhouse, if you will, and there would be a video there, and you just click on it, and you could see that touchdown scoring play. You could see Le'Veon Bell rip off a 50-yard run. We've seen it applied in baseball as well. You could see that Giancarlo Stanton home run. Those, kind of micro ways of viewing are already present. Now, not in real time, but they're very close to real time. They were almost not instantaneous, but within minutes. It could be a handful of minutes after that event occurred live. It was available to view in your league's, clubhouse or roster. So, that's stepping stone, and there's a lot of those in the industry, and it's an evolutionary phase that things are in right now, and having how do you deliver this content? How can you do it on the cheap? And that's an issue because there's a lot of budgets out there, and you see a lot of sites cutting dollars and talent as a result of that. We saw it at ESPN over the summer. We lost some good folks at Yahoo as well with the merger with Verizon. So it's got to get there, but it's got to take some time. And again, it just comes down to consumer demand. If they can push it and the ability to sell a lot of those platforms as well. If it's marketable to an advertiser, which I think it would be, it'd be a home run because fantasy demographic typically is to advertisers. If you can get somebody to attach themselves to that particular video product and throw some cash at it, then you can really take off.
I always think about it in terms of like MLB.com or the MLB.TV, where you can kind of split the screen into 4 and you can watch 4 games at once through your live stream if you want to. Why, and I mean, obviously you're not the one programming it, but like, why can't I program it that I don't want to just watch these 4 games, I want to watch these 8 players. So every time that they come up to bat, so I can see what they're doing in real time.
Think about the number of cameras you would need though for that. Think about that.
But unless they all came up at exactly the same time, they already have the 4. You can split it into 6 pretty easily.
You could, I think for baseball, that'd be the perfect litmus test, right? Yeah. Because it's such an individual sport, and you have these lapses in terms of time. You know exactly who's coming up, who's batting third in the order at that particular moment, and it's Chris Bryant, and you're like, oh well, we can cut away to Chris Bryant, and there's that live, and you could do that in every single baseball park across the country for those particular players. I mean, it's going to take a little bit of savvy behind the scenes to divvy that up and to stream it and pump it into a system. But I think for the NFL, you're talking about a tremendous amount of manpower and expense just for production value alone to pull that off. I think it's a great idea. I would love to see it, but I don't think anybody's going to put a whole lot of time and effort into it just because the costs are too exorbitant.
Well, I was just thinking about it in terms of NFL. So if you have, like, up in Canada, we have a thing called DAZN, which is just awful. It's like our Sunday ticket. So somehow they,
great.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's a clean, like, 30 seconds behind real time of what's going on. There's nothing like having the NFL weekend ruined for you on Twitter, and then you watch it happen not only like seconds later, like 30 seconds later. That's never a lot of fun. Although you can make some sweet, like, in-game bets if you're at a bar with people being like, hey. Yeah. Here's what's going to happen. I'll give you odds on this one. But if you have the ability to stream these games anyway, I think with where people are so comfortable with digital technology now that if you gave them the ability to have like a smart TV and you had the app on that TV and you almost had the same thing where if you can watch 4 baseball games at once on like 4 split screens, there's no reason that you can't just have the exact same thing with football as well, where you can program the 4 games that you want on your screen, yet there would be just one, it would just have to be an application within the app that almost gives you like how you would direct a show. Paul, switch to the 2-shot right now. Boom, they hit the button and we go to the 2-shot. And then we go to the split shot. And we can switch in between all these shots. It's not the most complicated thing in the world to do as long as it's set up for you in a very easy to do manner. So if you wanted to have your 8 games on, there was like 2 you really wanted to focus on, you could pin those into the 2 top slots and then switch between the 2 bottom ones. That doesn't seem like it should be out of the realm of possibility, or the expense for it besides developing that app shouldn't be all that costly.
Well, and DirecTV is already kind of doing that in a way with their game mix, right? So if you have a Sunday ticket, you can sit down, you can watch 8 games at once. Now, do you have the ability to pin, two prominent games or to, pull it out full screen? You can pull certain games out full screen. I think you have the ability to do a quad box. You can do a side-by-side as well. But, pinning and then, shifting the other games below it and bringing up the other ones larger, they don't have that kind of flexibility yet. Doesn't mean they're not working on it. Maybe they are. But again, we're consumers. If we demand something like that, there are enough people that do the same, then they will make that adjustment. So, that's an idea. If Dish Network's down the street here in Denver, Colorado, I could go knock on their door and say, hey, guys, we should be doing this instead. Maybe they'll listen to it. But, it's all about consumer demand.
You had mentioned the layoffs at ESPN. You guys had lost a lot of people. When I was at Fantasy Network, we lost a bunch of our staff basically overnight, and it really hurt the production of what we were able to output and really spend time on. But a lot of it broke down to was that one person now within media can do the job of like 4 or 5 people. I know when I was working there, I shot the shows, I cut the shows, I audio mixed the shows, I built the graphics for the shows. It became too much after a while, just because not everyone can just sustain that pace after a while. You start going nuts. But the ability with technology to limit the amount of jobs that we're seeing, and where fantasy, despite having a trade association and a writers association, it's a non-unionized position. It's a lot of contract work that they can get rid of people almost overnight. How, even in today's landscape, and we kind of talked about this off the top of breaking into the industry, how big of a factor is it now that if you're going to be breaking into fantasy, that not only being a good writer or a potential broadcaster and be good at different mediums and do different sports, how much technical wherewithal do you think that you need to have even entering it? Because again, I would never I had a TV show, now I have this show. The only reason that ever happened is because I was able to produce it and put it on air. If that wasn't the case, I'd be working at Starbucks.
Well, and you're a very unique talent in that regard because you have that production background, because you have that technical education that you can execute in many ways. So that, again, speaks back to my original point about versatility. So your versatility is a little bit different. It's not necessarily, you cover everything. You have, all the bases covered in your world. I mean, not only are you tech savvy, you have a producer's mind, you're on camera talent, you can speak to a variety of sports, and you can convey that information not only in print, but also through the auditory word or also in front of a camera. I mean, that's invaluable. You're a unicorn in this industry. There's no question about that. So congratulations on that. So, but if you're somebody that's breaking in, do you have to have a tremendous amount of tech savvy? I think you have to have some. I think you have to have a lot of social media savvy. I think that's probably paramount. I think that's probably the most important attribute to possess, along with that versatility across sports and conveying messages, again, whether it's through the spoken word, the written word, whatever it is, you got to be comfortable in all those facets, because you will be then more attractive to an employer, because they may say, okay, we've got 3 guys doing the job that we could hire you for 1, right? So it's all about the bottom line. That's what you have to think about too. Put yourself in a position of your boss and think about it from his perspective. It's always going to be about how can we increase the profit margin? How can we trim fat here and there? If you are bringing value to a company, whether it's because you help out in production or execution in the tech side of things, along with being a talent, that's how they're going to view things. It's like, how can I save a couple of pennies here and there while still maximizing performance across the board? So yeah, again, versatility, tantamount in the fantasy industry.
Do you think that if you were breaking in today that you would cover any season-long sports, or would it just be daily fantasy? If it was just fresh starting in the industry?
No, I would definitely cover season-long, because, DFS it's stagnated a little bit this year, right? We saw that massive explosion a couple of years ago. You saw a lot of participation in the sport and interest in the sport, and then you had the legal setback, and it started to diminish that a little bit. Now we've seen a bit of a rebound, but I think it's still going to plateau, because I believe that traditional salary cap DFS is intimidating to the beginning fantasy player. So until you can strip down and simplify games and offer those simplified games to the consumer, they're going to shy away from your traditional, guaranteed player pools, GPPs, or whatever it may be. And also the stigma that's attached to that because the fallout legally of a couple of years ago is still fresh in a lot of people's minds. So I think season long still, is the king in this industry. It's very apparent. I know you think the FSCA's research is a little bit shady, but I believe it. It's probably 75-25 in terms of players. Of the 60 million people that play in this industry in Canada and the United States, 75% are probably more season long than they are DFS. And I don't think that's really going to change anytime soon, especially with football, because football is king and people want that extended experience, right? You draft in August, you maybe put in $100 with your buddies, and that $100 lasts for months, unlike a DFS competition, which is more of an instant gratification game.
Well, the way that I would think about it, like if I was approaching it as being a writer right now, and obviously the one thing that almost every single fantasy analyst has in common is that they all do football. Everyone does football. It's by far the most popular one. And you're right on your splits between season long and daily, but I'm just thinking if you're trying to get into this to get a paid opportunity, I think that rests more with the daily side right now. It's not necessarily easier to break into, but people are far more willing to pay for daily fantasy advice than they are for season long advice, which is basically free for everyone at this point, no matter where you go.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. And I might know this may be a delicate subject, but in terms of sports gambling, again, if PASPA is struck down, you look at some of the content that's out there in the sports gambling world. It's not good.
Well, it's because those people feel like they need to hide behind a rock, too, though.
They do, to a certain extent. I agree with you there. Plus, it's very old school in that mentality. It's kind of that back room filled with cigarette smoke. A bunch of old guys or raspy voices talking about, hey, I got this hot lock today, guaranteed to win if you dial my 1-900 number. It's kind of that mentality that still exists and that stigma that's attached to it. As a result, you're not seeing a lot of great quality content in the space. Now, if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Chris Christie in the state of New Jersey and that gets overturned in the United States, you're going to see a second gold rush that occurs in the sports media industry. Fantasy was the first with the advent of broadband in the early 2000s, and this is going to be the second, and you're going to see a flood of quality, personality-driven content that comes into the sports gambling space, which is desperately needed right now. And putting a common man's face on the business, I think, is something that needs to happen because, I like to dabble in it from time to time. And, I don't want to necessarily listen to some dude that, is kind of a shady individual that, sits in that back room puffing away in a bunch of fat cigars talking about his, 1-900 days. It's not VSIN what Brent Musburger is doing. You want to trend to a younger audience and to appeal to that younger audience. So if you want to break in this industry, I would almost take a hybrid approach where it's fantasy and it's sports gambling together and creating some great content out of that. Because if you hit it at the right time and PASPA gets struck down, you could take off and build in a hurry.
Well, I think that the hybrid approach actually does make a lot of sense anyway, just based on whatever you do want to cover. Like, I still do season long, I do daily fantasy, and hell, I talk about gambling from time to time on my Twitter feed. Not on DraftKings, because that would just be crazy. But
Yeah, crazy,
insane. But I mean, I live in Canada where you can legally gamble. Like you can go to the corner store and put a parlay together if you want. I can go to any course of like 5 different sites and bet on any sport that I want at any time. I do it from my phone, open up my app, and boom, I'm good to go. But I know that's just not the case with a lot of viewers, and just there seems to be a weird sensitivity in terms of gambling that people aren't ready for it to be particularly mainstream. There are people, but I feel like those people have already found barriers around how to do it anyway.
Well, there's research out there in the United States that people are very accepting of sports gambling and the potential legalization for it. I think at the latest polls, like a USA Today Gallup poll that was conducted about 6 months ago, I believe was over the summer, it was like 65% were in favor of it. It's not as taboo as it used to be. I mean, certain areas of the country, particularly, let's say, the Bible Belt, where you have a lot of conservative ideals, I think it would be frowned upon. But there are also, some states down there are making inroads. Mississippi is one of the states that's kind of championing the cause because of, some of the areas in Tunica up there in the northern part of the state that have, a lot of casinos, riverboat casinos. They want some of that action. I mean, what's the difference between sports gambling and, say, poker, right? I mean, there's strategy to it. But one is viewed as, oh, this is completely inappropriate, and one is viewed as acceptable. And maybe not in the online space, but certainly in the casino space. So, it's going to be like marijuana in a way, too. It's going to go state by state, where every state's going to decide a little bit differently how it's going to be executed. Some states are going to offer parlay cards, some of which you have up there in the Great White North. Some states are going to say, Like I live in Colorado, there's only one town in the entire state that you can gamble legally. It's Blackhawk. Actually, it's two. It's Blackhawk and Central City. They're right next to each other. It's not Native American owned. It's state run. I believe in this state, if PASPA is overturned, you'll only be able to place a sports wager in within the confines of those two communities at one of the casinos up there. But other states may say, hey, we can make a lot of money doing this online. The lottery system could run it. So it's going to go state by state and how it's going to be executed. Again, very similar to how legalization of marijuana has come down the pike.
I want to swing back to something you said a bit earlier and being comfortable, finding your voice and doing that. Do you think it would be... It would suck for anyone trying to do it, but it inevitably happens to everyone that tries to break into the industry, is that you basically write for a year or potentially longer, and no one really reads your work, but you do it every day. And I always think that's one of the biggest things that people really overlook when it comes to breaking in, is that it's not necessarily that you need to write every day to become good, but you need to write every day to get into that consistent habit of writing every day. If you do stuff every day, I mean, there's a reason that I do a show every day, that if I always feel like if I go away for 2 weeks and I don't have a show, that people just might not come back. They might have moved on to everything else, something else. Because I know, like, when I listen to podcasts and a podcast I like goes on hiatus, I might not come back to it because I might not notice. So I just think getting into that habit of doing something all the time. But do you think that's beneficial to almost basically write for a year and have no one read it, just so when you come out the other side, you're just a lot better than you were when you started?
Yeah, correct. I mean, you got to approach it as like a shooting guard in basketball, right? A shooter's got to keep shooting. So no matter if you go into a slump or not, it's all about defining a rhythm and finding what is comfortable for you. So, yeah, I mean, you got to crank out a lot of material. The hours are long in this industry. You know that as well as anybody. You got to work nights and weekends. This is not your typical 9-to-5 job. It's something that you may be working 70 hours a week. Football is a grind. It starts in late July, and I'm literally working 7 days a week nonstop. And that includes, replying to people on social media, which I try to be as accessible and interactive as humanly possible, or creating content and writing, or, taping a podcast or a television show that I created and write and co-produce and star on, or, helping out on Fantasy Football Live on Sunday mornings. I mean, it takes a lot of time. But you want to have, multiple hands in cookie jars, across all platforms. So you are staying fresh. You are staying relevant. And I think writing is key. And I know there are some sites out there. Let's, look at foxsports.com that pivoted entirely to video and abandoned the written form, which is an art form in a way. I think that's criminal. And in fantasy, I think the best way for you to collect your thoughts and organize them and to remember them is writing them down. Write them down on your screen, on a piece of paper. It helps in the process because then you can just regurgitate information and people are going to think, wow, that guy, he knows what he's talking about. So it makes you look smarter as well. So, yeah, I think those are all key touchstones that you hit on. But, yeah, I mean, writing is really the crux of the fantasy industry as a whole.
Yeah, I think that writing is a core, no matter what you want to do, whether if you want to be an on-camera presenter. I mean, I don't use a prompter when I do the shows because it's
I don't either.
It's supposed to be like a conference. I don't mind, like, if I need to make a video that is like a minute long though, and it needs to be a minute, and that's the guideline that I have to script that out. And if you don't know how to write, that's going to be somewhat impossible. So having writing as the base of your foundation to do anything, whether it be podcasting, whether it be video, or whatever it is you want to do, even social media, being a good writer will help you on Twitter. It'll make you funnier. It will make you more concise. You can reply to more people. It'll make you more interesting. I've always been of that belief that it starts with writing and works out from there. And I don't think that a lot of people, especially in the fantasy industry, are bypassing the writing part. There are people that are coming in that are just more picks than anything, and that they can talk about that. That's a route that is very difficult to do to come in because you need to establish yourself somewhere, and just having that base, I think, is really important. But I just don't know that coming in now, that just having a blog, like I'm just trying to think about how I would do it. And I probably would just skip the blog part of it now and just go straight into yelling into my phone and having hot takes.
The other thing you could do too, in terms of the writing, so it's not completely lost, is, and I've experimented with this on Twitter before, where I've taken paragraphs on a particular player, maybe it's a hot take or, something that's on my mind, and I'll jot it down in a Word document and then just create an image out of it and post it on Twitter. I have seen a tremendous amount of success in terms of traffic with those types of perspectives. People are still consuming the written word. They're just doing it in micro-sized bites. And, you have to be clear, you have to be concise, you have to be supportive and measured in your arguments, but you could still write, 10 different perspectives, which would, accumulate to maybe 1,000-word article on 10 different players, but break it up and introduce it in individual tweets per paragraph. So you're still feeding the, short mind span of that Twitter follower consumer, while also hitting a lot of those key points and also honing your writing skills overall. So that'd be a great way to approach it if you're somebody that's a greenhorn trying to get in the business.
I remember going to Yahoo when I just first started playing fantasy, and like when I started to get into it and I started thinking about actually doing this, your stuff was up there. And the one thing I always really appreciated about it, I mentioned this to you when you got nominated for the Hall of Fame, I thought it was very well deserved because you had a voice. And that's something that I didn't really see, and I think that's one of the reasons why Matthew Berry's been so successful too.
Yeah.
Just being around for a while, that obviously that helps, but having an established voice that when you're reading that, you know that it's them.
Yeah.
What do you think the best way to go about creating that is? Because it took me a while to find mine, but once I found it, it's like, oh, this is how I write. I don't write in APA format. I don't necessarily write in full sentences, but when people read me, they know it's me because I'm telling scandalous jokes and just making hot takes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's it. I mean, you gotta play to your personality, just really kind of have some self-introspection and ask yourself, who am I exactly? And what do people know me for? For me, it was being loud, obnoxious, a lot of salacious commentary here and there. And, I would try to get away with as much as I could within the confines of an article. And, and you're exactly right. I just want to kind of go back to a key point that you made. When you click on an article that you wrote, if you're somebody that's just a general consumer of that article, within the first paragraph, maybe even the first sentence, you want to hook them with a line that is so quintessentially you that immediately they say, oh, that's a Brad Evans piece. That's a Matthew Berry piece. That's a Pat Mayo piece. I know exactly, based on the tenor, based on how it's written, based on the personality that it's presented, that is who that person is. Because then that automatically rubber stamps your brand. It reaffirms it, really, because then they're going to be like, okay, well, hopefully if they're a fan of you, they'll continue reading the piece. Then again, they may be like, oh, hell no, I'm not going to read this Evans idiot. I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, this long diatribe about whatever it may be and go elsewhere. But still, they identify that piece of content, even that very small, minute piece at the top with you and your brand, that is a huge win. So that's essentially the care that you're trying to get a hold of in this business and building that unique brand and voice.
All right, any more industry things to talk about? Because the final thing that I did want to touch on was the amount of work that people do for free in the fantasy industry. I mean, I don't want to say it's a problem, because if it was a problem, that's how I broke in. I worked 3 years for absolutely no pay, just grinding, and eventually it paid off for me. And I know that people don't necessarily have that luxury, but it's also taking away from the bottom line of full-time jobs as well. So it's really a weird, tricky situation to be into. It's a job that people covet. It's people that they want to do, and people are willing to do it in their free time. If they're a teacher, they can teach all day, and when they get home at night, especially if they don't have kids or they're not married, they can spend 3 hours pumping out great research, and it's really good content. Like, the difference between super high-end paid content and really good free content is not a huge gap. Now, when you look at all of the free content, then it starts getting into a bit of a dicier territory, just because you have the entire pool of people putting out stuff. But like, how do you go about kind of reconciling that difference between paid jobs, free jobs? Because those free jobs they're going to be there, and people will always take them.
Yeah, and that's kind of the big issue right now. I mean, I tweeted this out earlier in the week. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry, yet there are just really, a couple of handfuls of full-time jobs overall. And it's because of the want and desire of so many people wanting to break into the industry that they're willing to do anything and everything possible for free. They're basically glorified internships. That a lot of companies don't have to go out there and spend a ton of money on content creators and distributors because of that willingness that exists. Now, I agree that premium content should demand dollars. And, at Yahoo, we've got a great team of, I would feel, premium content writers, some of the most decorated writers in the industry. Scott Pianowski, he's up for an FSWA award. Andy Behrens runs the FSWA. He's won multiple awards. Liz Loza is a great voice in this industry as well.
Shout out to Dalton.
Dalton Del Don. Yeah, Dalton's my man. Another guy that can talk across platforms and touch on every single sport. and a great degenerate gambler, by the way.
I was in Vegas with Dalton around just before last March. I got him to put, I think it was like $50 on Charles Schwartzel at 80-1 to win the Masters. He almost got there. He lost by like 2 strokes.
Dalton would. This is how Dalton would say. If you go up and convince him and say, "Hey man, you want to wager on something?" Dalton be like, "Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm totally in. What is it? Was it just what $100, $20? I don't care what it is. I'm in. You know, he's kind of neurotic like that. That's why I love him so much. I mean, I remember betting with Scott Pianowski at the last, I think it was 2 years ago, the FSTA that Mark Cuban spoke at in Dallas, and we're at the Ice House in downtown Dallas. A few adult beverages occurring. And Scott and I are looking, we're just like itching to wager on something because we're bored and we're outside in this, massive beer garden. And they had a tape delayed women's college basketball game between Kansas and Kansas State. Again, tape delayed. And we said, let's wager on this. What is it? And I'm like, set the line. I'm like, where's this game at? It's Kansas. And you're thinking, well, I'm thinking in like men's terms. Oh, it's Kansas basketball. So the women's team's got to be pretty good. So I'm like, I'll take Kansas, Scott, for $20. Give me a line. He goes, I'll give you 3. And he took Kansas State. Kansas State had this woman on their team who she was incredible, and she was unstoppable and dominated. So that's how that was one of the lowest betting moments of my life, Pat, was the fact that I wagered, again, on a tape-delayed women's college basketball game at the Ice House in Dallas, Texas. So these are the people I hang out with, and that's why I love working at Yahoo Sports.
I think the worst thing that I've ever ended up betting on, I was in Vegas and I bet on Kazakhstani paintball. I bet on the blue team. They lost.
You can actually bet on Kazakhstan.
It was like 3 o'clock in the morning. That was like the only like live thing that was going on. They had this like super sketchy feed coming in. And I was like, hey, it could have been filmed out back and rigged for all I know. But all I knew is that I was up and I was betting on it. And I lost. Which is
that's like the highlight of Asia, I think, is Kazakhstan.
Yeah, it's the highlight of the Eastern Bloc. But I did, before I want to talk weather with you just very briefly, but before I get to that, in terms of premium writers versus free writers, I do think that the big thing that the daily fantasy industry has done has broken off a lot of these offshoot sites. And those places have become really good spots for people to break in, especially people that are very good at specialty sports, whether it be soccer or hockey or college basketball or golf. Well, not so much college basketball anymore because you can't play daily fantasy college basketball. But for some of the other stuff, like soccer especially, like there's so few good North American fantasy soccer writers because, frankly, season-long fantasy for soccer isn't really a thing. It only exists in the DFS realm. But where those are all premium sites and you need to get behind a paywall, those writers do get paid. That's why I would think that if it was me, I'd probably go full-time DFS trying to get there. But then you get into an interesting situation is if you're behind a paywall and you're at a site and now there are, I wouldn't say thousands, but probably like 50, 60 good daily fantasy sites where you can buy content that your work just may never get seen. That's why I always insisted that my work be free. First of all, I'm not the best with picks, so I'd feel really bad charging for my picks.
Yeah, me too.
It would just be really bad news for me. But I always wanted to reach as many people as possible because I always wanted to take more of a macro approach to fantasy than a micro approach. And I think these DFS sites take a very micro approach, and some of the people writing there have become very profitable winning and very profitable being writers at the same time, and people who subscribe there have ended up winning a bunch of money doing it, and the writers do get paid on that basis. So I think if you're looking for a paid path, that's probably the best way to go, at least at first, to get in and get some money in your pocket.
Yeah, I mean, because if you're really covering a sport very closely, it's like Dueling with Kings, and the writer, from that great book, he broke away from a Wall Street Journal job and focused on the NHL. He didn't know jack about hockey. His wife covered the NHL, but he didn't really cover. He covered other sports, but sold out and devoted himself entirely to it and understood the line changes and everything else, and turned into a champion. So, you can profit in multiple ways. Yeah, you have kind of this nest egg that you can sit on with your salary that comes in. Maybe you're making $20K a year, but if you have a little bit of cash on the side that you can allocate to your profession and your own advice at that micro level, you could win a lot of these GPPs and some of these cash games that are out there and really start building up your profit and then becoming, in a way, a tout. And building a brand that way. I mean, look at Peter Jennings and Jonathan Bales and those guys and what they've done with Fantasy Labs. Or Alvin Ziedenfeld and his brand and what he's done with his partnership through ESPN. So there are avenues where you can, reach riches in a way in this business. And one other thing here, kind of on a related note, you and I talk about how our picks aren't all that great. That's one of the key components in this business, is to accept transparency and just have water roll off your back, right? We don't have the magic formula at all. We back our reasoning with sound advice, with statistics, with whatever it may be, strong takes, and we let it ride. But you have to accept the fact that you're going to be wrong. You're not going to be right all the time, and that's okay. And the troll's going to come after you. I like to feed the trolls, like to have fun with them. It's one of my favorite, components of my job. But you have to accept the fact that you're going to fail, and it's okay, and you will survive, much like meteorologists.
So that's what I wanted to get into. So do people know that you used to be a weatherman?
Well, now, I wasn't a practicing
weatherman, but so you're a trained weatherman, just not in practice. You're like the fools that go to law school yet never practice law.
Yeah, so I was a teacher, and that's why I had a lot of free time on the side, as you mentioned before, kind of creating content when I was working at TalentedMissRoto.com. I was actually writing during my prep period. Or, you have to stay after school. You're supposed to be, preparing for the next day's lessons. Well, I already had all that stuff down. I was a pretty good lecturer. I'd memorized a lot of the information, everything, so I could convey it very clearly and have a lot of debate and things like that. So I had free time that I could devote to my craft and really trying to hone my skills. So I went, I have a history degree from the University of Illinois, and I was, secondary education was my minor. That's how the system and the education system is, tailored for, students from the U of I. But I went back to school to get my master's degree from Mississippi State, which I did online. It was a geoscience degree with an emphasis in meteorology. I thought down the road that maybe I go back, become a practicing meteorologist, maybe a broadcast meteorologist, kind of like Jim Cantori of the Weather Channel, be in the thick of things, when that tornado's barreling down on a town or a hurricane or whatever it may be.
So basically, you saw the movie Twister and said, that's me. I'm Bill Paxton.
Yeah, that was going to be me. That's kind of what the dream was. And I also wanted to teach at a small university or college. And then fantasy interrupted and disturbed that dream. So I ended up going off and doing the fantasy thing and not really using my applied meteorological skills except in rare circumstances when weather becomes a factor in the NFL.
And that is what I want to find out about, because I've always been on a thing. I remember I freaked out at my buddy Cust and I did a show live from Gillette Stadium this year, and people were like, "Oh, it's so rainy right now in New England. How can these guys ever play on the field?" We were at the stadium looking up and we're like, "It's not raining out. I don't know what the hell you're freaking out about." Is it just something for people to get stressed about and worry about? Because we've talked about it off air, and I've always said this, wind seems to be the only thing that really affects these games. That's consistent, at least, that you can predict. Like snow and rain, good for the offense, bad for the defense. Offense knows where they're going. Defense doesn't so much. Nope. So it just puts them at a disadvantage. Now, it's not going to work out 100% of the time because nothing will. But wind seems to be the consistent factor. So, what is the actual amount of wind that will affect a game?
Yeah, let's establish what a strong wind is. You see a lot of these reports from fantasy analysts out there that think they're practicing meteorologists, and they'll say, "Oh, it's a 15-mile-an-hour wind. That's gusty. That's blustery conditions." Last I checked, a football is aerodynamic, so it can cut through the wind if thrown appropriately. Now, if you're chucking wounded ducks like Peyton Manning, in his waning years, then that's a problem because you're increasing the surface area and thus friction, which could, divert the football one direction or another. But if you're throwing a tight spiral like an Aaron Rodgers, or I think one of the tightest spirals ever thrown that I've ever seen was by Warren Moon back in the day, one of the prettiest balls, that's going to cut through just about any wind. So I think establishing a sustained winds. We're not talking about gusts either. There's a difference between sustained and gusts. Sustaining consistent winds. Usually it's about 25 miles an hour. You could argue 20 to 25 miles an hour. That's kind of the demarcation line of the impacts of weather on the flight of the football. But again, these have to be consistent winds in that environment. And some stadiums are constructed better to take on wind than others. And you have swirling factors, almost a microclimate that exists inside, say, like an Arrowhead Stadium or a MetLife stadium as well in New York. Or actually in Jersey. But it does vary by venue. But it's sustained winds of 20 to 25 miles an hour or greater that have the biggest negative impacts on a football game. It's not the rain. It's not the snow. It's not the bitter cold, as you mentioned. It is clearly wind and wind only.
So would that mean that, I don't want to get too much into wind. Let's say when gambling is legalized and you see something like a 30-mile-per-hour wind in that game, is that something you want to rush to go hit the under on?
Hammer the under. I mean, we've seen it, and to a certain extent too. Like go back to that Buffalo game where that lake effect snowstorm broke out, and they had training effect over Orchard Park, and that's meteorological speak that nobody really cares about. But it just consistently came down in big, fat, wet, fluffy flakes, and then you had the wind driving. And it wasn't so much the snow, but it was the wind. I saw that. I immediately went to a not-so-legal offshore site and hammered the under in that game because not necessarily of the snow, although it did play a factor, but it was because of the winds. And the other thing, too, the snow played a factor because it was so unpredicted, right, in that particular game. They expected, some snow. I was watching the forecast 48 hours in advance, and it went from on NOAA's website, very reputable sites where, you should look at all of the meteorological projections and predictions that are out there. It went from a dusting to 1 to 3 inches to 4 to 6 inches to a foot plus within a 48-hour period. And really those last two categories of, prediction occurred within an hour of kickoff. So these teams were completely blindsided. And if you notice in that game, they didn't have the proper footwear. They didn't have the proper cleats. They're at halftime, and the guys on the sidelines, equipment guys, they're screwing on longer cleats, rapidly, as fast as they possibly could to try to have these guys trudge through the snow. So that was a very unique circumstance because that storm came out of nowhere, and the intensity was totally unexpected. So it played into the under big time. As that game, what was it, like 7-0 or 9-3, something like that?
All I remember is I had bet the Colts in that game. They ran the 2-point play, got the 2-point conversion, then they called a pick play on, I think it was, Jack Doyle caught it, but they called it on someone, and then it cost me the cover because it ended up being a push. So I was very disappointed with that. That's my recollection of that game, besides a lot of the snow.
I just remember LaShawn McCoy, sprinting in the end zone, and I was going nuts because I had him in a high-stakes league, and I was thankful that he found 6 late. I think it was in overtime or something. I know it was really late in the game, and that was the clincher.
But the big thing, it's funny you mentioned the cleats, because I was talking to Keith Bullock one time about the game where they got blown out in New England. It wasn't really a blizzard, but it was super snowy. He said they showed up. They didn't have snow cleats for the game. They were basically playing with tennis shoes on the snow.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened to the Indianapolis Colts because they're on the road, and unless you pack that stuff, and you're a dome team to begin with, and if it wasn't in the forecast, it was just basically it was light snow. It might have been a dusting, and they're probably wearing proper footwear for that kind of snow depth, which would have been minimal. But when you have 8 inches on the field instantaneously, within a blink of an eye, when you have snow rates of 1 to 2 inches per hour, which is what was occurring during that game. They didn't have those spikes. It'd be like, wearing platform shoes, but all spikes running around. They didn't have that at their disposal, and it put them at a terrible disadvantage. So now it's little things like that play into the DFS mentality. It plays into the, the overall gamers mentality and approaching whether or not you should start or sit or, ride with a certain team.
Brad Evans, check him out on Twitter if you don't already, at Yahoo Noise. Brad, tell everyone where they can find all your ongoing college basketball, fantasy football, all your content, plus your podcast. Where can we find all of it?
Yeah, sports.yahoo.com. You can check it out. The Bracket Big Board is going to be debuting, I think, in a week or two. Usually we do it the Monday after the Super Bowl. We're going to have some great content as well from the Super Bowl as well from our Verizon nest overlooking the stadium. I'm going to be conducting a ton of interviews with a lot of big name NFL players, so you definitely want to check out that content.
Don't steal don't steal all my guests, by the way. I'm going to be there. Just leave some for me. I can have Lance Moore. I already have Lance Moore booked, so you can't have him.
Nice.
Yeah, you can have Joe Horn. I'll take Lance Moore. We'll be good.
Yeah, I'm down with that. I tell you what, I got your number. I'll just send them your direction because I'm going to be in a completely different location. I'm away from Radio Row, so I'll definitely be shift those guys in your general direction, and hopefully you land some of those big interviews. So yeah, and also the Fantasy Football Hour is going to be coming back next season number 3 across Fox Sports regional networks. From coast to coast, we aired in over 100 million households at the end of the year, and Fantasy Football Live as well, which got nominated for a slew of awards by the FSTA and also the FSWA. YahooSports.com will be back for season number 13 next year. I believe so. So sports.yahoo.com. I haven't missed a show. I've got a Cal Ripken streak. So knock on wood, that continues in 2018.
I was going to bring something up. Now I completely spaced on what it was. But 13 years. It's really been 13 years?
I think it's been 13 years. Next year will be year 13 of Fantasy Football Live. And I was there from show number 1 on. It's been an amazing ride. We were the first ever fantasy football show. I think we're the first ever live sports studio show on the internet. Oh, wow. And we're going to be airing our 13th season next year. It's just a tremendous accomplishment that Yahoo Sports has pulled off over the years.
I can't even believe the internet was that good in order to stream it 13 years ago.
It wasn't. There are some people still probably struggling on their 28.8, 56K, connections, seeing me talk like this.
And then you did have to pray too that no one called into the studio, because then someone might make the decision. Oh, I got to make this call. Got to boot you off the internet for a sec.
Yeah, there was our filters. We had a couple of people that dropped some F-bombs in the early days because there weren't proper measures.
Okay.
I guess we learned from the state of Hawaii on how to execute back then.
Oh, jeez. You mentioned on the Altitude show that you're on the show, you're a producer, you're a writer. It almost speaks back again to if that job existed. Let's say there was a fantasy football show that was 20 years ago. You would only be the person in front of the camera. There would be people doing those other jobs. So when you speak again to versatility, that's almost a part of it as well. You're now putting on a producer's hat, you're putting on a writer's hat, and then performing everything, because that's one job now. It's not three.
Well, and that's, again, one of the key components that you have to have, and one of the key assets is that ability to be versatile and also to evolve with the times. I'm a restless person. I know you are too, Pat. And for me, I get bored doing the same stuff over and over again. And you want to be ambitious, and that's going to be attractive to your employer as well. And, it's going to allow you to plant firm roots in this industry, or any industry for that matter, over the long haul. So, you want to kind of, down the road, I may get out from, freezing people's faces and making retinas bleed with my not so dashing looks, and just wear the producer's hat and maybe even direct and do some things like that. I mean, you see that a lot in Hollywood, right? You see a lot of prominent actors who come out from in front of the camera, get behind the camera, and start producing and start directing on their own, because they have that drive internally of, all right, I'm a creative mind. I see it this way. I'd like it to go that way. And they follow that path and carve out a brand new avenue to their career. So it's something that everybody should aspire to do.
My final thought on this, my best piece of advice, don't look for a job in the fantasy industry on LinkedIn. That's probably about it.
Smart.
All right, I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me at ThePME on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience wherever you can download podcasts, especially Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and always iTunes. Plus, watch the video version of the Pat Mayo Experience up on the DraftKings YouTube page. Thanks for watching. Hope it helped a little bit if you're trying to break into the industry, and if not, hope you had fun anyway. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.